Hello, Shrewnivers, and welcome back to the Shakespearean Shrew. I am your Shakespearean Shrew, Karen Finer, professor from the University of Oklahoma and lover of all things bard. This podcast is a decorum-be-damned entrance into understanding Shakespeare's stages, for there are many, and all the players on it. Today I am excited to be talking with Corey Whaley, who is playing Horatio in OSP's production of Hamlet, which is opening very, very soon.
Yes, very soon.
We are so excited to have you here. So, tell me a little bit about your acting hobby, as you called it. You said you are a 36-year-old acting hobbyist, which I think is amazing. So, how did that start? And how did you get to where you are now?
It didn't start with an interest in theater necessarily, but in middle school I liked singing in choir, and then I started performing in show choir, which is a very cheesy experience. And the same group of people would audition for shows. So I think I was like in the 8th grade. We did a musical called Teen 3, which was written for middle schoolers, so it was horrible. And then as I got into high school, I continued with show choir, and we were required to audition for everything. So that's how I kind of started doing theater. And then, I think it was the summer after my freshman year, I auditioned and played Rolf in The Sound of Music in the very last musical produced by Edmond Community Theater, which does not exist anymore. It's a long time gone. But that was the first time I did anything outside of school. And then, I don't know, when I graduated high school, I continued doing shows in college at Oklahoma Christian. Most of my friends, they didn't have a theater program per se, but they did have a pretty big music department. Most of my friends thought I was a music major because I hung out in the music building all the time. And then it just continued from there. About a year after I graduated college was the first time I auditioned for Oklahoma Shakespeare in the Park. And then for many, many years, I did as many shows every summer as I could, because then you auditioned for the entire summer season. And they would do 3 or 4 shows every summer and a show in the winter. And then I lived in Dallas for about 17 years and just moved back last year. So now I'm getting back into auditioning for and doing shows at the theaters that I love to perform in before.
We're so happy to have you back.
I'm so happy to be back. And Hamlet's a show that I have never done before. There are a lot of shows I've been in multiple productions of. But this is my first for Hamlet, so I'm excited about that.
Well, and Horatio is a pretty substantial role in Hamlet, so that's a very cool.
It's also the role I always wanted in Hamlet, so I was thrilled to be cast as Horatio. And then right after they cast the show, I was reading stuff online about the character of Horatio, and apparently there are some that think Horatio has absolutely no bearing on the plot of Hamlet, and I was like, great. But I kind of disagree with that, because he's kind of he's like one of the few constants, I think, in Hamlet's life, so I really like the role.
I would agree. So is that what made you like him before? You said that it was a role that you wanted to play.
That, and I think the role of Hamlet itself is such a huge role, and so I think there's always, everybody's looking at that under a microscope, I think, and so I always felt like, well, Horatio, nobody's giving it the same kind of level of examination they give to Hamlet, so you could probably do more of whatever you want with that role, and there's probably less of a chance that somebody's going to pick apart like everything you do.
That's a good point. So in terms of Horatio as a character, right, he is usually portrayed soldier, military, very honorable, upright. Are there any other adjectives that you would use to convey your portrayal of Horatio?
I think my portrayal, I think he's a little bit, I approach it in kind of a more relaxed way, because I think of him as being the prince's best friend. So I'm not a courtier, I'm not a soldier, I don't necessarily work for like the king or the queen. I'm just a friend of the prince. So I feel like Horatio's job is more to be a friend to Hamlet than anything else. It's not necessarily to like carry out the will of the king or queen or anything like that. So when he's in the scenes where he's in Elsinore, like at the castle, I don't think he's quite as in awe of like royalty as such, because his best friend's a prince.
Well,
So I think he's a bit more relaxed than other people might be.
Well, it's so interesting because you have Guildenstern and Rosencrantz, who are academics, right? Students, not supposed to be maybe as affected by rank, and yet they are obviously very impacted by the king and queen and catering to what they want over that of their friend.
Mm-hmm. I kind of, and I look at Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as being, number one, subjects to the king and queen, and being friends to Hamlet as kind of a secondary thing. And I think that's the big difference. Because Horatio is also, I mean, he was referred to as a scholar, so he's also a student and very academic. But like I said, his first loyalty is to Hamlet as a friend.
So I was talking to Joshua Murray, who is our Hamlet at OSP, and we were talking about the very low survival rate
Yes.
in Hamlet.
Yeah, that happens in tragedies.
It does. And you actually happen to be the sole survivor in the final scene on stage. And so he was very thrilled about that, by the way, just so you know. He's a big supporter of your survival.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
But what does it mean to you in that role to be the last man standing, to be the one who is told to tell Hamlet's story?
Well, and I think that's just it. As like the last man standing, that's his responsibility, is to make sure, and he mentions that too towards the end, is that it's kind of his responsibility to make sure the story is told correctly. Which is interesting to me because he provides that in the play already. In the very first act, most of what Horatio does is provide plot exposition and explains, like in a monologue, explains all of the politics that have been going on between Denmark and Norway, which are important, but that's not the main focus of the show. But other characters basically ask him if he knows what's going on, and yes, he does. And so he explains all the politics and all about Hamlet's father and why he was important as a king. And then, once we get to the end of the show, that's going to be Horatio's job once again, is to make sure that these things are told and in an accurate fashion.
So when you're thinking about, because he's also the one who's like, hey, there's a ghost that kind of looks like your dad. Let's go check that out. So he's also the one who introduces that very large plot point. So in the first act, we have the ghost king, and everybody can see him. In Act 3, only Hamlet can see the ghost king. What do you make of that difference? Do you think that that's more a depiction of Hamlet's mindset? Do you think it's more the determination of the ghost?
I think it's a determination of the ghost, and the reason for that is that Horatio is a skeptic. When he shows up at the watch at the beginning of the show, he doesn't think he's going to see a ghost. He thinks it's nonsense. Then it does appear. So I think that's the way to know that the ghost is the real deal, is that Horatio, who does not believe it's ever going to show up, sees it and is shocked by it. And is a little bit nervous to bring it up to Hamlet when he does.
Yeah, he's like...
That's how do you tell someone, hey, I saw your dad. It's crazy, but he's walking around the castle, so thought you might like to know.
Thought it might be helpful. Yeah. So I think you really touched on a lot of what Horatio does in this play. And I think you're also right in saying contrary to what a lot of people have said, where he doesn't really have a lot of legs as a character, he does a lot of the things that otherwise, I mean, it's already a 4-hour play, people. We can't ask any more. And I think he takes a lot of the exposition, a lot of those moments where we have to kind of fill in the blanks. Like when Hamlet comes back and he's telling Horatio what happened, Horatio becomes the sounding board. He is the person who hears all, sees all. And so he's kind of the perfect person, I guess, to tell the story.
Yeah, I think as a skeptic, he is always going to be the person in Hamlet's life that is grounded and will try to kind of bring him back down to earth. When Hamlet decides that he's going to, I believe he words it as putting on an antic disposition to kind of throw Claudius and Gertrude off the scent that he knows what's going on. Horatio's kind of in on it, and he lets that go. He doesn't try to reel him in too much as far as that goes, but he is there to kind of, I guess, keep him from his head going off too far into the clouds. You know what I mean? Like, let Hamlet do what he needs to do, but I need to be there. Horatio needs to be there in order to keep him grounded a little bit.
It was
to make sure he stays on track.
Yes, Joshua described Horatio as his sanity. And I was like,
I like that. I like that. You know what? Now that I've heard that, it is almost like, it's almost like Jiminy Cricket.
Yes.
To Pinocchio. You know, he's there to make sure things don't go
horribly wrong.
Yeah, he lets things get a little bit crazy because you have to let someone make their own decisions. But
right. And I mean, it is
someone's got to be there to
help.
It does go horribly wrong. I guess there always needs to be somebody there to pick up the pieces. So Horatio's fine with that.
Yeah.
It needs to be done. He sees it as a job that needs to be done. He's very practical, I guess, in that regard.
That's true, and I think that goes along with his personality really well, as being very practical and pragmatic.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So, have there been scenes that you have found to be really fun for you, where you're like, oh, I look forward to this scene, this one is a whole lot of what I love to do, or vice versa? Any scenes where you're like, oh, this is the obstacle scene, this is the one where I've got to fight for it?
I think one of those fun scenes to me now, because of the way that we're approaching it, is in the play within a play in the middle that's being performed, so we can kind of get a gauge on, does Claudius look guilty or not? Because Hamlet needs to be sure.
Right.
He needs to be sure that Claudius is guilty of what we all suspect, as far as, you know, killing his father and marrying his mother. Kind of a extreme thing to do. But there's almost like a celebration of that right after the play. And I can't recall having seen it done that way before, but it really is kind of a celebration, which is a weird thing to say. We're celebrating the fact that we know Claudius is guilty, but we're celebrating the fact that this plan of having this group of players work in certain plot aspects so we can kind of gauge whether Claudius looks guilty, and then it works. So we're thrilled about that. And you know, I've described Horatio as being practical, and you mentioned pragmatic, but in that moment, he just kind of lets loose and lets himself celebrate the fact that this kind of far-fetched plot that Hamlet came up with to determine someone's guilt actually worked. So there's a little bit of a, you know, celebration of that for a little bit. And it's very brief, but it's very fun to do. After having Horatio, you know, I mean, I try to let him have a fun side to him as well, and he's not so formal or anything like that around Hamlet, but letting him cut loose a little bit with Hamlet after that play within a play is a very fun thing to do.
Nice. I always find the rat trap such an interesting part of the play. One, because Shakespeare often uses plays within plays, which not really a new thing for him, but to use it as a trap, to use it as a way to determine somebody's guilt or innocence. I always find that very interesting, and I love that Hamlet's like, yeah, I figured it out, you're guilty. Because I'm like, what king would want to hear that, have somebody say like, hey, you're I caught, or kill a king on stage and be like, yes, as a king, this is good. You know what I mean? So I almost feel like it's one of those where I'm like, is he actually conveying his guilt by getting upset with this, or is he already looking at this and saying, this is not a good topic to have?
I think there's a moment where Claudius indicates that the plot's going kind of a bad direction for us to be watching. And so Hamlet has to reassure him, hey, you know what, this is just a play, don't worry about it, it's just a play. I think Hamlet has a line that it touches us not, or something like that. So I think Claudius shows a little bit of resistance, like, should we actually watch this entire play? Because it seems kind of off the rails. Hamlet convinces him, yeah, we should. And then it gets to that moment where, he has to shut everything down because he can't take it anymore.
Right.
So yeah, I think that actually, and I hadn't really given that much thought until now, but yeah, there is that moment where he's like, wait a minute, I don't like where this play's going.
Right. And Queen Elizabeth herself has done that many a time, where she was like, oh, who are you trying to convey me as? Or where she read into a play and was, miffed, to put it lightly, at the direction a play took.
And I wonder also if part of it isn't just Claudius realizing that, or feeling kind of exposed, but the fact that everybody else is watching this play and the circumstances in the play is exactly what's been going on in Denmark, so it should tip off a whole lot of people.
Well, and that's, again, what I find to be so interesting with this specific production, is just because that's kind of what a lot of Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe's plays did, where it was like, here, we're going to set this in Malta, or we're going to set this in Venice, but all of the conditions are going to replicate what is happening in England. So we're not talking about England, we're talking about Venice or Malta. Here you go. And so, again, and that's where, for me, the overlap is so interesting, where Shakespeare is creating a commentary on the system within the system.
That is a really good point. That really demonstrates what a good playwright Shakespeare is. And that's something that still goes on. As soon as you talked about how it addresses things going on in that time, like it's not just a play, that made me think of The Crucible, which, wasn't really about witches and the witch trials.
Right. Oh, that was my question. Surprises. As you've been performing Hamlet, have there been any moments where you've been surprised by a direction that it's taken, or a choice that Tyler has made as director? Has anything kind of come to you where you're like, oh, this is interesting, or this is a new way to look at X?
Well, like I said, this is the first time I've been in Hamlet, and so when we started working on it, in my head, Horatio was only what I already described, which is friends with Hamlet. There are some places in the play where there might have been lines from, it may have said in the play, gentlemen, for example. And those have kind of been distributed to other characters where it would make sense. There's a scene where Horatio is speaking with Gertrude. There's also a gentleman in that scene, but it's all Horatio because he's already there. So I think what the surprise is for me was being able to see how Horatio connects to other characters, because he does have direct conversations with Gertrude. He has some interaction with Claudius, though not very much. And there's also a little bit of connection with Ophelia. They don't have a conversation necessarily, but it is shown in the way it's staged that Ophelia knows who Horatio is, and when Hamlet isn't there, when he's been sent off to England, very briefly we can kind of see Horatio as an anchor for Ophelia. So it was a little bit surprising to see how much more interaction Horatio can have with other people there, not just Hamlet.
I love that.
Yeah.
So, as somebody who is a self-identified hobbyist, a lot of times, especially with acting, people think, okay, it's all or nothing, right? It's your life or not. And so I really love the fact that you're doing this as something that you love to do, but it's not all that you do.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to other people who are worried about getting involved in theater as a hobby, or maybe hesitant or worried about especially getting involved in Shakespeare as, an acting possibility?
Well, one thing I would say is that with theater, you have a little bit of control over how involved you get, because when you're working on a show, that's pretty much all your spare time. Like, we opened this week. I'm not doing anything else, But there was a point in time, especially when you're around, I think, college age and immediately after. For me, anyway, I think this is true for a lot of people, if theater is the main thing you do and that's your love, you spend all your time doing that. And so there was a period of time when I would audition for Oklahoma Shakespeare in the Park. I would do 2 or 3 shows in the summer. I would do the winter production. And often I would do probably a couple of shows at Carpenter Square Theater, in what's the off season for Shakespeare in the Park. And there was a time when I was either performing in or rehearsing for, or maybe both, some kind of play somewhere. And that's a lot of time. But it turns out you can scale back and just have as much fun as you want in theater. There was a point, I never thought I would get to this point, but there was a point where I was kind of burnt out with theater. I had been in a couple productions I wasn't particularly passionate about, but I was in that mode of you audition for everything. So having been in a couple of productions I wasn't crazy about, that was really taxing. And I thought, you know what, I'm not going to audition for anything unless I really want to be in it. And then I didn't do theater for 4 years. But when I got back into it and auditioned for a play, it was something that I really wanted to be in. So the point of all that, I guess, is that if you're interested in theater and you're concerned about some kind of like work-life balance, you don't have to spend all of your free time doing theater unless that's what you want to do. You can also do, just a couple shows a year, and so that can kind of scratch that itch for you.
Thanks. So with creating a good environment for a play, do you think that a lot of that rests on the rest of the cast? Is the cast the big determiner of whether a particular show will be successful and have that chemistry? Is that something that the director creates? What's the balance you think there?
Oh wow, that's a really good question. I do think a lot of it rests with the cast, but it's up to the director to determine, through auditions, and hopefully there's a lot of people the director's worked with before, so they have kind of an idea how people work. But I don't think it rests solely with the actors. I do think it also depends on the tone that is set day one. And with Hamlet, from day one, there was a particular structure to it. I think a lot of theaters now are more aware of the kind of power they have to create a safe space for creation, and where people can experiment without necessarily crossing boundaries that actors might have. And I think theaters are a lot more aware of that now. And at least with this production, that was set up at the very beginning. And so I think when you set the right tone for a safe place to create, I think that's what you will have. I think that even if, I don't want to say But I think if you set the right tone up front, I think you're less likely to have issues within the cast.
So what makes you, because you said that there were some productions that you were a part of that weren't maybe necessarily your happy place, that wasn't something that you were passionate about. What is it? Is it the storyline for you that dictates whether or not you're passionate about it? Is it, again, the energy and the atmosphere created by the Playhouse? What for you determines, ooh, this is something I want to be a part of, or I'm going to wait and sit this one out?
I think sometimes it can be the subject matter. One play that I was doing around the time that I got burnt out was just, it was so heavy. It was the Little Foxes.
Okay.
In Hamlet.
Yep.
Oh man, first of all, I think I was miscast in that show. I played, if you're familiar with it, I played the ailing husband, who's usually quite a bit older. But they went with the slightly younger casting for that for some reason. But it was just, there was no character in that show that was happy and having a good life. And it was just really hard to get through that play and feel like, at least from my perspective, that it was doing any amount of good for the audience. Like if, I can stand like sad movies and plays, but as a friend of mine once said, if there's not a little bit of hope at the end, he's not interested. So I did not get that feeling from the play Little Foxes. So if there's no shred of hope at the end, I don't think I want to be a part of it. And I think that's one great thing. I also like to do a lot of musical theater, and I think it's harder to find that. If you have characters that have such high levels of emotion that they have to break out into song, there's always going to be something there to hold on to. So I think that's part of it. And I think Hamlet is the same way, because once you get to the end, you know that life is going to go on in some form in Denmark, just not the way it was at the beginning.
Well, and I love it because you're talking about this aspect that you're looking for, this hope. And in Hamlet, you are that hope. You are.
That's a really good one. Horatio's the one that's going to carry on the story.
Yeah. You are that moment. I love it. Okay, so as we are talking about these different elements of performance and why we perform, for you, how does performance connect to community? Is there a connection between either performance and community, theater and community? C, all of the above?
That's a really deep question there. I feel like that, well, I'd like to think that theater is available for the entire local community. I know that not everybody's going to go, but I do feel like there is a theater community here. But I do also think that there are a lot of loyal patrons that might favor one theater or another. But what I always think about is that, this may not directly answer the question, but there's the question of, is it really theater if there's not the audience there for it? You know what I mean? Because part of the thing about theater being theater and why it's different than TV or movies or something like that is because you're right there with the audience. The art is being created right there in front of their eyes with them.
Right.
And they're a part of it. And I know that any actor can tell you that the audience definitely affects the show. If it's a quieter audience, you could go in a couple different directions, especially if you're doing a comedy and it's a quiet audience. I think the actors are more likely to really push and overdo it, trying to get that reaction they want out of it. But I think with something like Hamlet, which is a tragedy, obviously, but any kind of solely dramatic work, it's hard to describe, but it's kind of a vibe that you get from the audience. Because they're not going to be booing and hissing the villains and that kind of thing. But when it gets really quiet, I think in this context was something at Oklahoma Shakespeare in the Park. When you're outside and it gets really, really quiet, except for like the ambient noise around you, you kind of know that the audience is into it, and you feel like you're part of the same team there. I don't know if that's necessarily the sense of community that you're talking about, but I definitely can feel that during a show.
No, I think that's a great answer. That's the part that I love about theater is the living, breathing, moving aspect of it, where you see a performance on Thursday night and it's not the same performance as Saturday night. One, because there's always actors changing things slightly, doing things a little bit differently, but also, like you said, the audience response changes the performance. And so that's one of my favorite parts of theater is that you never know.
And you're absolutely right about if actors do, you want to be creating it in the moment. You don't want to be a robot. So there are moments that you do pretty much the same every night, but it might change just a little bit. A character might respond to you in a slightly different way, and that's going to affect the rest of that conversation. So yeah, one of the great things about theater is that you can, and I've gone to see, the same show more than once before, and it's not exactly the same. It's never going to be exactly the same.
And that's what I love about it. I think a lot of people put this pressure on it because we live in a world of TV and movies where they somehow expect a reproduction. And they're like, oh, I'm going to see this. It should be exactly what I saw 10 years ago. Why isn't this Hamlet the same as Mel Gibson's Hamlet? And you're like, no. That's not how this works in theater. And so I think sometimes there's a disconnect because we don't recognize that it's not like you're going to rewind it and play it again.
Right.
And it's, we have these expectations. And I think it's especially true of classics when you're looking at Shakespeare's works, when you're looking at as the holiday season starts to come towards us, any of like the Christmas carols or how Who Stole Christmas? How Somebody Stole Christmas.
The Grinch.
The Grinch. I don't know. My brain just stopped and I was like, someone stole Christmas. I don't
Well, it's not
remember.
quite time for it yet, so our brains aren't quite there.
Thank goodness. But
the only productions I've been in of Christmas Carol, I think I did it twice, and that was with Shakespeare in the Park. Back when they did those productions. This would have been in downtown Edmond. This is way back in the day.
Now it's the Christmas Cracker.
Mm-hmm.
That's always a fun one to go to. But, again, it's that idea of, even if it's a tradition, even if it's something you go to every year, I'm hoping what people realize is that the great thing about theater is you can get a sense of the familiar, but also a new perspective, a new way of seeing the same story. And I think that's what's so interesting about the last lines of Hamlet, where we're talking about telling a story. Because stories, there's so many different ways to tell them. And so, I don't know, I always wonder, I'm like, oh, he's gonna tell a story. What story is he gonna tell? Is it this story that we're watching right now? Is this the story that Horatio has told us? Or is it going to be a very different story from this one?
That's interesting. There are a lot of shows, movies and plays, where it's almost a story within a story, and one of the main characters, you'll see at the end, sit down to write it out.
Right.
Sometimes.
Yeah, it's always an interesting kind of play, and it leaves questions, and that's what, for me, Hamlet is all about. It's all about questions and asking the hard questions and not ever really being certain of the answers. It starts with a question, who's there? And that kind of conveys to almost every, and I'm gonna exclude Horatio from this, but it's kind of all-encompassing of the other characters because we don't know who they really are. We don't know, even Ophelia has been forced to play so many roles. And she's forced to be the dutiful daughter, she's forced to be the dutiful subject, and those roles put her at odds with her own desires to the point where we're like, who are you? Who is Ophelia? And I feel like that's the same for almost every other character. You're my one exception.
Well, I think one of the few strong relationships that he has is with Hamlet. So thinking about this now from this direction, that's who he is. The person that he is around Hamlet is who he is.
That the authenticity, and that's what we're missing. That's why we don't trust Hamlet. That's why we definitely don't trust Claudius. Like, we don't trust them because we can't figure out who they actually are. But Horatio never gives us any reason to think that he is anything other than who he says he is and shows himself to be. And so it's that one idea of, that one character and moment of authenticity throughout. And he's, in a sense, the anchor, the sanity of the play. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and we see him the same way when he's with the watch at the beginning. The way he behaves then is exactly how he behaves when they go and find Hamlet. And he's really the same guy, even around totally different people, when he's in scenes without Hamlet, when he's with Gertrude, or briefly with Ophelia and Claudius as well. He's the same person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a fun way to think about your character.
Well, he has nothing. He has nothing to gain, I don't think, by being someone other than himself. I mean, he's not trying he's not conniving to get something out of people.
Right. He's the only one not playing politics.
Yes. He's there to be a good guy and help his friend.
You have to stay strong then.
Yes.
Okay, so I have my questions that I have to ask for all of my shticha. I have my questions that I need to ask for my Shrooniverse. And you can answer all three, or you can pick one. And it is your favorite line in Shakespeare, your favorite character in Shakespeare, or your favorite play in Shakespeare.
Wow. I don't know about line. That's a really good question. One of my favorite shows, though, is Much Ado About Nothing. To me, that, and I will always think about the Kenneth Branagh, Emma Thompson movie, but that is, I think, one of the most rewatchable plays of his that there are. And there are stakes in that one, and it gets serious, but it doesn't get overly serious. It doesn't take itself seriously.
Right.
I guess is a way to look at that. And that's usually just a fun show to see.
It is, and all the characters. That's one where Beatrice, I just love her because she has so much depth. Like, that is a woman who you're like, oh, that's a backstory. You have a backstory. And we start to get pieces of it, so it's fun. It's fun to connect the dots on that one.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite roles, I played this, it was a college production, so I was really much too young, but it was playing Cassius in Julius Caesar. I wish I could give you more specifics, but I just remember how much I enjoyed doing that. It wasn't, I think one reason I like it is that it wasn't a role that I had particularly considered as something that, oh, I would always love to play this role, because it's not one of the roles people usually think of when they think of that play.
Yeah.
But I remember it was challenging for him to, I mean, he's a villain, but you know, it's not that interesting to play someone as a villain. So trying to create a character that is so far along in his career when you're in your 20s is challenging enough. But wanting to make someone a human character and not just a cardboard cutout was particularly challenging. So I think that's one of those roles I always like. Like, I like to see those productions and see how somebody else does it.
Well, and he always reminds me of like the Lex Luthor of villains, where yes, he's the villain, but he's trying so hard for everybody else, and he thinks he's the hero. He thinks he's the hero of his story. And so that's always one of the fun ones for me, because I'm like, oh, you're trying so hard to be the good guy.
He's doing what he thinks is necessary,
Exactly.
like for the greater good. So he's also like the Thanos of the
Yes,
Shakespeare.
yes. That is a much more, my students would much more appreciate that reference. Lex Luthor is a little dated.
I wish I could think of a single line.
Oh, like
that
I
stands
said,
out. I can't. There's so many, and there are so many. I will tell you from this play. One of my favorite lines is, I'm gonna mess up. But look, the morn in russet mantle clad walks o'er the dew of yon high eastward hill.
Okay.
Tyler pointed that out in one of our rehearsals, just as an example of the poetry that's just there. And I agree, those are two beautiful lines that they're not absolutely necessary. I mean, Horatio could just as easily say, well, it's morning, so let's pack it up.
Exactly.
But it's said in the most beautiful way, and I think that's one of the great things about Shakespeare, because there's nothing that's just plain about it. There's so much beauty in his works. That's why people still perform these plays and people go to see them.
Yeah, and why they perform them in early modern English, for those of you who keep asking if it's in Shakespeare. Early modern. But yeah, and I think, I was talking to somebody earlier and they were like, the reality is that his audience probably struggled understanding the meaning as much as we do. The words are maybe just a bit more familiar to them, but they weren't used to listening to things in iambic pentameter. Like, they weren't like, oh, this is how we talk every day. No. And so I think sometimes we think, oh, this is so difficult because it's 400 years later, as opposed to the language is poetry. It's moving as fast as the actors are. It's moving as much as the people on the stage. And so we have to move, not only deal with moving people, but language that's moving as well.
I've always thought that, not that this is an original thought, but a lot of people think of Shakespeare being performed by these orators that are being grand with their speech and, putting on some kind of affected British accent. But no matter what play it is, if actors are performing and saying the words as if a real person would say them, so much easier to understand. And I think speed is part of that. I think if you are super slow and enunciating the words and pulling them out a long time, I've always said that if I go see a show like that and somebody speaks that way, by the time they get to the end of the sentence, I've already forgotten what they started talking about. So I think in Hamlet, speech I read, if you speak it like a normal person would, it's a whole lot easier to understand.
I agree, and I also feel like nowadays with all of our speeding up things, we tend to listen to everything on 1.5 times rate. So when people are slowing it down, you're like, why are you talking so slowly?
Guilty. I listen to podcasts sped up normally, and then every now and then I'll listen to something, and for some reason I have no idea why, on my phone or whatever, it'll switch back to just 1x, and it sounds so slow. It is just unbearable, so I have to speed it up because I want to hear everything quickly. I don't need to hear it drawn out.
Yeah, my boyfriend is the same way, and every time we get into the car, he listens to his podcast, and I'm like, why does it sound like chipmunks are talking? But it is what it is. All right, so, anything else you want to address? Or should we call it a wrap?
I think we covered everything. What we just talked about is one of the things I always think about when I think about Shakespeare, is just the speed of the words and saying them as if a person would say them. So.
All right, so just a reminder, Hamlet will be showing at OSP until September 29th, so please get your tickets. It's outdoors, it's going to be beautiful weather. You know, go grab a pizza at Sauced and bring it over because you can bring your food and, you know, come hang out with us. So thank you all for listening. I would love your feedback. What did you like? What do you want to hear about next? And please subscribe to the email list on our website. Just remember, all the world's a stage, and you too can be a shrew.